Thank you. And for our final panel today, we're going to be talking about data protection and resiliency. So please welcome to the stage Sanjay Poonen from Cohesity, Charles Henderson of IBM, and Denis Kennelly of IBM. Thanks for being here. Gentlemen, welcome. So far today, we have spoken about the opportunity and the value that all of this innovation can bring. But obviously, we're talking about a lot of data, in some cases, very sensitive data. So of course, there are a lot of cybersecurity risks that have to be managed. So Charles, I would love if you could give us a sense of the current security landscape in this space and the challenges that customers are facing.
You know, it's kind of funny because I hear a lot of the strategies that are being employed here today, and I think to the threat actors and realize the threat actors are actually deploying the strategies we're talking about today and have been for 3 years. And that means they're gaining efficiency, they're gaining aptitude, and they're gaining control. And I'll give you a quick example of that just statistically. If you were to ask me 3 years ago, how long does a ransomware, soup to nuts, how long does it take from the point at which the threat actor gets access in the environment to the point at which they accomplish their goals? Would have been 2.5 months. If you ask me that today, it's 4 days on average.
Wow.
It's a 95% efficiency gain. And what that means is we've gone from a security industry that's focused on preserving the perimeter, keeping people out, the castle wall, to a security industry that's focused on resiliency. What do we do when the attacker gets in? How do we detect them? How do we respond? And keep in mind, you have 4 days now. And then what do we do if they do accomplish their goals? What does that look like? Security has become, rather than a silo, something that is a one-team phenomenon, whether it's storage, whether it's infrastructure. You know, one thing we try to do with our clients is break them of the phrase, "that's not my job." Because when it comes to security, no matter what your solution is, no matter what, it's your job. Because if the network, if the infrastructure, if the company goes down, if the assembly line goes down, it is absolutely your job.
Yeah, and I'd love to, on a practical level, what does that look like? If it is the production line or whatever it may be, we've heard so much about ransomware, not just today, but, it seems like there's new headline every day. So, when these attacks occur, whether it's ransomware or something else, how do you keep the business going as it's happening? And then how do you recover after the fact?
That's a great question. It really depends on the industry, but look at what the attackers have done. Again, 3 years ago, financial services led the way in terms of targets. If you were an attacker, you were a threat actor, you would start with financial services as your designated target because that's where the money was. Over the pandemic and several other supply chain shortages, attackers learned that they could actually get money through the classic extortion model from manufacturing and folks with assembly lines. When a meat packing plant had ransomware, the price of meat went up in the eastern United States by 10%. So you're seeing real world consequences of ransomware and other cyber attacks because there's a lack of resiliency. And what that means is the attackers started attacking manufacturing. Now, the bad news for financial services was that their attacks didn't go down. This was business expansion for threat actors. But now the manufacturing space is actually the world leader in target for attacks. And that's a huge shift. And that represents, again, how agile those threat actors are being. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that manufacturing knows down to the penny how much it costs when their assembly line goes down.
Right, they quite literally can't afford the downtime.
They can't afford it. They're going to pay, and they're going to pay quickly. And that's music to the ears of a threat actor who's focused on return on investment and quick payments.
Right. And Denis, I want to bring you in because Charles just spoke from the security space, and you've held positions in leadership across both the security space and now the storage space. So I'd love to hear for you, how do those two ecosystems intersect, and how can they deliver better solutions for customers?
Sure. And I think, what Charles talked about, I had 5 great years in security, and when you actually see the IP that's being applied to this, to the bad side of this problem, right, it just, if they were working on what Abhijit talked about, it would be in a very different place, unfortunately.
Yes.
But when I really start to look at this problem and look at data resilience and start to step back, like we design data resilience, or sometimes we call it backup. We designed it for a point in time to recover from a hardware failure or logical data corruption, right? So, and it was pretty targeted. So when that happened, there was a particular system or a particular storage device or a particular application, and you said, okay, it's down. I go find the data, and I recover, and I bring everything back up. We do the root cause, and we move on. When you get to the world that Charles is talking about, when you come under a ransomware attack, everything is down. And you cannot trust a single byte of data when that happens. So you're in a situation when this happens, what's the first thing that happens? Probably panic, right? What am I going to do now, right? What is the first step I take? So I think when we look at this problem with data resilience, we kind of look at it under 3 major things you got to look at. Clearly, as Charles talked about, is early detection. You got to have some leading indicators, because when the threat actor shows up, they run reconnaissance. They just don't just show up and knock the door down and in we go. They're poking around for some time. So having that early detection and working closely, in the case of IBM, in the IBM community with our security brethren, and being able to use AI to actually get those early detection insights. And it's not just with IBM, but any other security vendor. That's really important. And I mentioned AI because it's an overused word, I know, and I know Rob talked a lot about it, but you really need it, because when you're dealing with these environments, you have millions, if not billions, of events going on. So you got to, weed through the noise and say, okay, this is what's happening, and more or less target in on your critical data, the data that really, if anything happens to this data, my whole company stops. So number 2 is, and you'll hear us talk about something called a cyber vault, or you'll hear us talk about safeguarded copy. You've heard it through the day. And just talk a second about what is a cyber vault. What do we mean when we talk about a cyber vault? Well, with a lot of things in computing, you go back to the bellwether platform of computing in the industry, which is the IBM mainframe. And we came up with this concept, working with HSBC Bank in the UK. They approached us a number of years ago. They're a CIO, who happens to be in the audience, Alan Peacock, and asked us, look, my regulator is coming to me, and I say, if I get a cyber attack, I need to recover within minutes. So we got to work, and we built this concept with HSBC and with Alan's guidance of a cyber vault. So what is it? It's an immutable copy of your data. So what I mean by immutable is, by definition of the word, nobody can access it. That actual copy cannot be directly accessed by any one individual or any one system. That's what we call a cyber vault. So you wonder, okay, you have a copy, so how do I get the data? You can get the data by copying that copy and take that data out and start to test it and test to see, is that infected? And when we talk about things like safeguarded copy and cyber vault, what we mean is vault is the thing we're putting it into, and a safeguarded copy is copying it into. It's a core building block of our storage infrastructure. So early detection, cyber vault. Okay, now I potentially have a copy. Now I got to get into the recovery business. Now recovery, back to my backup analogy, we design networks to recover one application. Remember, you got to recover petabytes of data now, right? So you got to have, recovery technologies that can scale out very quickly when you're in this situation. But more importantly, what are you recovering? You're recovering the data, of course, but you're recovering the application. And to get the data back is kind of step 1. Now I got to get the application up and make sure it comes up in a crash consistent way, in a consistent way once you're recovering it. And that depends on the application. There are particular workflows you got to go through. And when you're thinking about enterprise class applications like SAP or an Epic database or whatever, there's some very specific things you got to get done. And so with those 3 steps, we in IBM have really stepped back from what I talked about as backup and talked about early detection, cyber vault, and rapid recovery as critical to get this done. Now, that's a big vision and a big problem I've laid out there, right? And that's something we call IBM Storage Defender. But to pull that off, obviously I talked about the IBM community and working closely with the security industry at the front end, our mainframe brethren and customers. But to defeat this, you need a village. You cannot do this as your own as a company. And we looked in the industry and said, who has kind of a like-minded approach to do this? And as we looked across the data recovery and data resiliency industry, and the one company that came to mind was Cohesity. And I'm thrilled and delighted to say here today that we've established a partnership with Cohesity to integrate Cohesity into that Storage Defender platform, and we are working together to bring that to market as an OEM into the IBM company. But more importantly, working closely of the might of the 2 companies to go after this problem. And that's really kind of to come right back in terms of the learnings from my days in security, is bringing together what we did in security, what we're doing in storage, to really go after this data resiliency problem.
Yeah, Sanjay, I'd love to hear from your point of view, Cohesity, I'm sure you're excited about this partnership.
Yeah, no, just thank you for those kind words, Dennis. Just let me give you a 60-second sort of detour why I'm excited about partnering with IBM. About 18 years ago, I was a younger executive, probably pretty naive and ignorant at Veritas, and we structured a partnership with someone who was several years Rick's predecessor, a gentleman named Bill Zeitler, who has since retired at IBM, but he took us under the IBM wings, and it was a good partnership. I went on from there to be president at SAP, and I built a really good partnership with a certain Arvind Krishna, who's now the CEO of IBM, and we became good friends there. And then, and it was a fabulous partnership. SAP HANA, we did a lot of things with IBM that are still to this day very strong. And then later on, as COO of VMware, we built a really good partnership with IBM, again, with the same gentleman, Arvind Krishna. So about last year this time, I was sort of sitting on the bench after I'd left VMware on a couple of boards, and when Cohesity approached me, Arvind that has now become a friend and mentor of mine, I called him and said, listen, should I take this job as CEO of Cohesity? He had heard a little bit about it. Our founders, ex-Google engineers, built this tech that Dennis talked about, and it's groundbreaking, it's innovative. We think we're the best in the category. And we talked about all of what Dennis talked about in security, and he encouraged me to do it, but I said I would take it only if I could partner with IBM. Anyway, long story short, a few months later, he introduced me to Rick and to Rob and to Dennis, and I'm really grateful for the hard work the IBM team and us put together the last 6 months to make this partnership a reality. We've got some incredible technology, but all of you have probably heard of SAP and VMware, and everyone here knows IBM. Not many of you have heard of Cohesity. I hope you will after today. So we bring great technology where the scalability, the simplicity, and the security, those are the 3 S's that we focus on that differentiate us. And if we can integrate and embed this inside the vision that Dennis has for Defender, and really I think this is the coming together of 2 other S's, that's storage and security. And when you put those together, I think you have something that's very, very exciting for this industry. I mean, I'll sort of close this piece of it around, I think today when I talk to business executives, I jokingly say we hear about 3 R's, okay? Russia, recession, and ransomware. I don't know a lot about the first 2. I'm not an expert in the first 2. I may not even be an expert relative to ransomware to Charles. But the 3rd R, and if you couple that with resilience, is where we fit in. And we've got to do everything to work together as a village to keep the world a safer place. And it's not a matter of if now, it's always a matter of when before you're getting hit with ransomware. There's a ransomware attack every 20 seconds. So that's not said in terms to fear people away, but you just have to have the best protection and detection mechanisms and the best recovery mechanisms against the bad guys. And there's typically a few countries where they're coming from.
One might start with R. So, Sanjay, I'd love to dig in a little bit more on your approach, Cohesity's approach. You talked a little bit about this, but can you tell us more about how data protection infrastructure plays such a crucial role in combating these cyber threats like ransomware and so many others?
Yeah, I think, just as Dennis put, the traditional way in which this was built with a storage mindset, and typically you're building something that's faster, better, cheaper, because it's all about speeds, feeds, and so on and so forth. There are two advents of things that I think have changed fundamentally things. One is with scale-out architectures, which the cloud folks and IBM, again, you're coming back to the mainframe. It's not like this is new. Mainframes had that scale-out architecture, but that's replayed now very nicely in cloud computing architectures. You could redo in the way in which you thought about data protection. Traditional backup and recovery could be done faster in parallel, and it could be done often cheaper because it could be done in commodity hardware. You bring compute to storage, this phenomenon of hyperconverged could be applied to secondary storage just the same way it was applied to primary storage. So that's the first key innovation, and that's really the invention of our founder Mohit in terms of the way he designed the Google file system and bringing that mindset to the tech 7-8 years ago. And we were the first people to do that, and then many others followed our kind of investments there. The other key innovation is looking at this from a mindset of security, because the same way in which you thought about data leakage and so on could be the way in which you think about data. If you were bringing compute and threat detection to laptops, which is what endpoint security and so on do, you could apply that to large amounts of data. And typically between what IBM and us will back up or protect, we're talking hundreds of petabytes in the exabytes of data. So when you apply threat protection techniques there, it's a lot like detecting a disease. If you could have ways by which you're constantly COVID testing all the time on large populations of data, that's the exact same analogy of what people like Charles and I are trying to do on either large compute surface areas or on large data surface areas, and that the data part is what we do. And all those things that actually, there's an enormous parallel between healthcare and protecting what the world did the last 3 years and what we're doing in cybersecurity. What do we do? The first thing, we quarantine. The equivalent of quarantine is cyber vaulting, what Dennis talked about. Immutable, air-gapped capabilities that are isolated in sort of a clean room. What do we do a lot? We got really good at COVID testing. That's threat detection. What did we get really good at? We got really good at sort of even high-end testing of our elderly folks, whether it was blood tests or cholesterol tests. That's data classification. So I think there's a lot of parallels between how we fight the bad guys in security and the way in which we fought disease. And by the way, all of that's based on AI, which I was glad to hear IBM talk so much about today, because much of the way in which we fight disease is based on AI and much of the way in which we fight the bad guys. So these are all the techniques that make up a platform. What we need as a company of our size, we're not a startup anymore, we're a mid-sized company, is partners that extend our ecosystem. And there's no better great company that I've respected over the years, and we're just grateful to be doing that with IBM.
Thank you. And briefly, for our guests today, as they consider innovations, adding new technologies, but they're rightly concerned about data protection. The stat you just rattled off about ransomware, it is scary, but you also need to innovate. So what would your recommendations be for approaching that balance of innovating, but of course, still keeping data protection top of mind, Sanjay?
Yeah, I'll answer briefly because I don't want to talk all the time here. I think for us, it's a different size of company. I've seen innovation at big companies, SAP and VMware, and I had a different message to my teams there because they were in the tens of thousands. For a company like us that's a little over 2,000 people, we have to be, when I tell our engineers, we have to be 10x better than the alternative. If we aren't, and it doesn't have to be literally 10, but if we aren't, a great IBM's not going to come to see you as they scan the entire market and say, well, who should we partner with? So that means that our performance, our scalability, our simplicity, everything that makes a platform great, and it has to be built on technologies that are disruptive. I'm a big believer that the power of disruptive innovation is that as compute becomes pervasive and you go back almost ironically to that mainframe era, you can make things faster, better, cheaper, and safer. And to me, that's the holy grail. And then, of course, when it comes to ecosystems, as a big company like SAP and VMware, we had reach. We had a huge brand and so on and so forth. For a smaller company like us, my encouragement to fellow CEOs or C-leaders is build an ecosystem. especially this time when costs are under control and you're going to have to work to get to profitability. You need an ecosystem because, sort of like Isaac Newton said, right? I see clearly because I stand on the shoulders of giants. So to us, each of these, we take them seriously. We partner very closely with them. And then we also look for three ways. For example, I think some folks from Amazon are in this room. They're an investor in this company, our company, and also a partner. I'm glad that AWS and IBM are also working together so we can do a three-way to allow Fort Knox, for example, our cyber vault to run with IBM's help in AWS. That actually then makes that ecosystem even larger. Those are some of the things that we seek to do, Julianne.
Thank you. And now I'd like to leave some time for audience questions. This is our final panel for today. So if you have a question or a comment, please go ahead and raise your hand. Don't be shy. Anyone? Please, sir.
He forgot masking.
What was that?
He forgot masking in the.
Oh yeah, what's the equivalent of masking? Dennis, what's the equivalent of masking in this world?
Well, we can get into data masking. I remember.
All right, data.
Want me to go
Good,
there?
no pun intended. Right, there is a technique of data masking. Good.
Well, you know, we have a saying in security that if you want it to be secure, turn it off. I know that probably isn't the most positive message to end on, but
That's not innovation.
Maybe we took the analogy too far.
Great. Well, if we don't have any audience questions, I can just keep chatting. So I'd like to turn it over to each of you as you consider, again, the opportunities and the challenges. What are you most excited about, or what will you be tracking most closely in the near future? Dennis, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think, and Sanjay covered some of this. I think, what am I most excited about? It's building that ecosystem to attack this problem. This problem we're talking about right now really has the potential, right, to disrupt. And we see it. I've been involved in many situations. I've seen, regional hospitals taken down for 2 weeks. And then you kind of, this has all happened close to us, and people who can't get treatment as a result. This gets really personal, right? So really getting after that problem and getting, really attacking this at its source. Because if we don't do this as an industry, this has huge consequences. And I love to think of kind of analogies or points in time. And I'm a data storage geek, a security geek, but I think back to, post 9/11, the unfortunate incidents. But in the data and storage industry, that really gave rise to us getting disaster recovery implemented properly as an industry. And I think we're kind of at one of those inflection points right now when it comes to data and storage, when it comes to ransomware. And what makes me tremendously excited to be part of that and solving that problem for the industry. And it's not just IBM solving that problem, but working with an ecosystem of partners and collaborators to go after that problem, because it's a huge problem and it's not something we can do alone. We need to do it as an ecosystem.
Sanjay, how about you? What are you most excited about as you look to the future?
I think, listen, I'd build on that. The bad guys are outside us. It's even competitors should be partnering together. I think, we gave an example of sort of IBM, AWS. I think if we can look past our overlap areas and look for the common ground of where we could partner together. And I love the fact, IBM is very good at this, and I've sought to do this in all the companies. Which find a customer that you can co-innovate with. Dennis mentioned HSBC a number of times. When you find a large marquee customer, certainly the bigger ones have very complex scenarios, and you'll never have things completely right from the get-go. But you have to build a co-innovation where you said, okay, let's assume it's 70% there. You become like our product manager that guides us on where we can continue to evolve this platform. And you've got to constantly look for those pioneering customers who want to have their technology chiefs or their technology leaders co-invest with you. And then you have to create a culture inside your own company, engineering and customer success and all the folks who deal with them, to have 2 ears, 1 mouth. You're constantly listening to what you can work with the client to improve your product. And to me, when you do that, typically they guide you in the way. There's a few places you may not get that right. To me, one of my favorite examples was when Steve Jobs was talking about how he never heard from a client that Pinch or Zoom was what they wanted in an iPhone, because everyone was telling him use the BlackBerry keyboard. So a few times you'll have to, I think, listen and then lead, because it's not exactly what a client's telling you. But most often, my experience is that when you're listening to clients, you kind of get it right. And that's the culture you got to create within a company.
Thank you. And Charles, we'll give you the last word here. You talked about some of the risks folks are facing even as they try to leverage some of these opportunities. So when our guests leave the conversation today, Charles, what action would you like for them to take? Are there immediate steps that organizations should take to improve their protection of critical applications, systems, and data?
So, I think we can learn a lot by looking at abject failure in life. And my team deals with clients on their best days when they're doing security testing, proactive, and on their worst days when they have a breach and we do an incident response, and a lot in between when we're providing them with threat intelligence. But let's take a look at that incident response just for a second and say, when we get that first meeting in a breach investigation, and you look to the very first question that's asked, before you get to who did this, what happened, how did this happen, who's to blame, these are all popular questions in that first meeting. The very first question that's always asked is, when will we be back? Because that's the question the board asks first. And if you don't have a good answer, the rest of that meeting is one of the most uncomfortable meetings you can have. And I don't care what seat you occupy. And the sad fact is that the decision for that answer was made more than 6 months before the question was asked. Were they prepared? Because security is no longer a game of protecting the perimeter. It is about preparation. It is about constantly preparing for your worst day. Because it's going to happen. I guess I have the advantage of having a lot of job security. Hope no one heard that. But you look at that question and you say, what have I done to answer that question today? What am I doing to answer that question tomorrow? What's my plan to answer that question? So, one of the things we do this thing called the cyber range, where we run through clients on prepare for your worst day, right? And that's something you can kind of do at home. Just think about, am I prepared for my worst day? How am I prepared for my worst day? And what are my gaps for my worst day? Because before you answer any of those other questions that get asked in the breach investigation, you're going to have to answer that one singular question. When will we be back?
Thank you so much. And that is our time for this panel. Thank you, Sanjay, Charles, and Dennis.
Thank you, Jerry.